Johnny Tremain, Chapter 12, Part 2. Before reading, here are two more questions to help guide you to the key details of the part. 1. Who is Johnny trying to meet, and what happened to him? 2. What sights does Johnny witness on his way to Lexington? Part 2. Johnny knew he had no chance of leaving Charlestown until the few hundred fresh men who had been rolled over to hold the neck had been withdrawn. Next morning, he watched them go and waited his chance. It was 10 o'clock when he left the town. People were running about. Each had a story to tell. Many women, children, and timid folk had spent the night hidden in the clay pits. They, too, were coming out of hiding. Johnny, from sheer high spirits, jumped the now deserted breastwork the British had thrown up so hastily the night before. He had seen so much of the British army, he had come half to believe that they were, even as they said, invincible. No Yankee farmers could stand up to them. He had been impressed with their perfection of equipment, discipline, grand gaudy uniforms, the pride of their officers. "We beat 'em, we Yankees did. God was with us." He took the road for Cambridge, crossing desolate Charlestown Common with its salt marshes, clay pits, gallows, and gibbet. Everywhere he saw signs of the retreat, the heavy tracks of cannon, the road itself beaten to muck under anxious feet. He saw lost hats, uniforms, muskets even, and he saw a group of men getting a horse out of a pit. The horse was taking the matter sensibly, not struggling, seeming to understand that the oxen being tackled would pull him out. It was Colonel Smith Sandy. Johnny looked upon this as a good omen and walked forward whistling, but his whistling stopped abruptly. He had met his first burial party. He noted the faces of the men and women following the dead countrymen. Next he saw a cellar hole with smoke and stench still rising from it. There was a tavern, and in the tap room men sat about drinking rum and boasting of their great deeds. Johnny did not doubt, but they all had done as well as they said. But he was in no mood to listen. So, having bought bread, a handful of salt ale wives, and asked if anyone knew where Dr. Warren was, he quickly left. They told him to try Cambridge. Here a strange thing had happened apparently overnight. Milling about were hundreds upon hundreds, perhaps thousands of Minutemen. They had come as they were from the plow, the shop, even from the pulpit. Most of them had guns in their hands, but there were hardly a dozen overcoats among them. No blankets. They had no food, except the little their women had tied up for them, enough to take a man through one day's fighting. No tents, no extra munitions. What now was to be done with them? What were they to do with themselves? Should they go home now, having accomplished the mission for which they had been summoned? Or were they to stay and undertake the siege of Boston? They had no cannon. Seemingly, they had nothing but the guns in their hands and the fire in their hearts. A man who told Johnny he was a colonel, he did have a pair of homemade epaulets sewed to his old hunting shirt, said that the Committee of Safety was sitting at the Hastings house, trying to work out some way these civilians might be turned into soldiers. Dr. Warren was chairman of this committee. Johnny went to the Hastings house, where he met Paul Revere, who told him Dr. Warren had left for Lexington. Lexington! It was to Lexington, of all places in the world, Johnny wanted to go. Now he had an excuse for it. This day, like the one before, was warm and beautiful. It was one of those silent, dreamy spring days, when sunshine pours down upon the yet cold earth, and the earth turns in its sleep. No cloud in the sky, not one cat's paw of breeze. He stepped along rapidly. Not until he reached Menotami was he once again following the tracks of the defeated British army. A parcel of folk were standing about a stout old grandame. 6 grenadiers had surrendered to her and asked for her protection. She had no idea the battle was moving in so close. Old Mother Batherick had been out digging dandelions. In every house left standing, Johnny saw bullet holes and, once again, a burial party. 12 men, hastily thrown upon an ox sled, were being drawn to their single grave. And there were British dead to bury. Where should they be buried? The minister said they were to be laid in the lot set aside for slaves, but all who had hats doffed them as friend and foe passed by. Johnny had no hat, but he stood with bowed head. He walked on. The sight of a young woman drawing water was too much for him. He stopped and asked her for a drink. As he sat on a wall and drank from a wooden bucket, she answered his questions. Was he now in Lexington? Yes, he had just crossed the town line. Those Lexington men, how many were killed on the green yesterday? 8, she said. As he asked his next question, his voice sounded unreal to himself. Happens you know their names? She turned a stony face and stared at him. These are their names, she said. Let them never be forgot. She stretched out her hands and counted on her fingers. Jonathan Harrington, she said, and Caleb too. Robert Monroe, Jonas Parker, Samuel Headley, Isaac Muzzy, Nathaniel Wyman, John Brown. Rabs was not one. Johnny smiled. Do you know how the Silsbys fared? She said the women and children had, like so many others, gone away to hide. She believed they had gone to Woburn, but by now they might be back again at Silsby's Cove. And the men went out fighting? Of course, all except Grandsire. He wouldn't hide with the women and farm animals, and he couldn't go fight. He was sought on sitting it out under his own roof. Then Johnny went on his way, passing Monroe Tavern, where Percy had joined Colonel Smith. He could see the marks of the cannon and the destruction they caused. So he was in the village. The first thing he noticed, as he stood looking down at the green, was that the old meeting house had been knocked into a cocked hat by a cannonball.